The word today comes to us from the book of Exodus, chapter 3, verses 7 through 15. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of the land to a land of good, plenty, and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, the home of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites, all the ites. And now the cry of the Israelites has reached me, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt? And God said, I'll be with you. I'll be with you. And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain. And then Moses said to God, well, suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. And they should ask me, what's his name? Then what shall I tell them? And God said to Moses, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. This is the word of the Lord.
Will you pray with me? May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. So for those of you watching at home, good morning. And I assure you there's nothing wrong with your YouTube channel. The orientation of your screen is correct. I'm usually over there, and today I'm over here. You've heard of urban sprawl? Well, this is organist sprawl. You give us one note and we'll take 3 octaves. God's messing with me this morning because the organ's acting up. You heard that note sticking at the end? Yeah, so not sure why. There are 4 or 5 reasons why that could be. So all that means is like there's a bunch of like the really loud stops that I love so much that I won't be able to use today. It's an honor for me to be up here this morning, really. When Susie asked me, Susie has asked me to preach a couple of times, and it's like, I don't think you want to be giving me a microphone. Let's just leave me over there. And she's been kind enough to ask, and I thought, you know, I prayed about it. It's like, if I'm supposed to do this, fine. If not, fine. Let me know. And it happens that the book of Exodus is something that I can kind of get excited about. There's something I have to say about the book of Exodus. So I thought, okay, well, if there's a time when I'm going to agree to do this, sounds like it's this time. So, and if any of you fall asleep, I am prepared to shame you publicly. So, you know, I'm just saying, because I know all your names. All right. So I have one sibling, my baby sister Cheryl, my baby sister who's now like 62 years old. Some of you have met her. It's just the 2 of us. Both of our parents have died, and neither side of our family was ever very close. So we don't do family reunions, we don't do long Christmas card letters, none of that stuff. So it's just the 2 of us. And after our mother died, she and I made a commitment to each other that we would get together at least once or twice a year, Now, we live only a continent apart. I mean, she's in Virginia and I'm all the way out here, so it's not exactly over the river and through the woods to see each other. So it takes some effort. But it's paid off. She and I know each other much better than we ever have, and it's really awesome. She's so cool. As we spent time together, it's been fascinating for me to realize how differently we've reacted to some of the same family situations and dynamics, things we never talked about when we were kids, and how differently we remember the same family stories. My grandmother, who was a bona fide West Virginia hillbilly, was a wonderful storyteller. She could tell a story the way only Southerners can. They were always a bit better if she had a few shots under her belt. And the adjectives got a little spicier too, if she did. Now, one of the characteristics of her storytelling was that the plots and characters were, shall we say, fluid. Every once in a while, someone from one story would find his or her way into another story. And even if we caught on that she was taking liberties with the facts, we knew that it was going to be a great story no matter what. So we didn't really care. And even if she got the facts a little mixed up or exaggerated, the basic truth of the story was still intact anyway. Some of the stories about my grandmother are actually the best ones no matter who tell them. Like the time my mother had to bail her out of jail for attempted murder when she tried to steam her boss at the dry cleaner to death because he wouldn't give her the raise that he'd been promising her for years. That's one of the best ones. Yeah, I think she was a little spicy that day too. I have a couple of old friends who to this day remember stories that my grandmother told us when we were playing cards at the kitchen table. However, the flexibility with the facts drove my sister crazy. That's not how she said it happened the last time. I thought that happened to Aunt Mary Alice, not Nancy Catherine. It especially galled her if it was pretty obvious that my grandmother was just making stuff up. And I think my grandmother knew it too. My sister is much more interested in the facts. She's the left brain sibling. So she likes to know how things add up, whether we're getting the timelines and details correct. She doesn't care for fluff. It makes sense. She's been an accountant and a comptroller ever since she graduated high school. That's kind of what she does. I'm the right brain guy and much more like my grandmother. I'm more likely to remember the emotional impact of a story, how it felt to be there, rather than exactly who said what or who did this or that. And I guess, to be honest, like my grandmother, I've been known to exaggerate a detail here or there to make a story a little more interesting or entertaining. I'm not doing that this morning. The really cool thing is that when my sister and I get together and both tell the story, it's a more complete version. The facts she remembers sometimes jog something in me, and my take on it may add a layer to just the facts, and we end up with a richer understanding of the experience, even though sometimes we may not get it all historically perfect. So today, we're beginning this new sermon series on the book of Exodus. Hopefully while I'm up here, you'll see why I started with my story about my sister. But before we get into the actual Old Testament epic, and it is an epic, as you know, let me share a little personal anecdote that connects me to this extraordinary Exodus story. So in 1968, I was just beginning to learn to play the organ. My dad bought me a small, portable combo organ and amplifier, which I used for years in my work with the local Wheeling, West Virginia nightclub band, John Pesci and the Constellations. Oh dear. I would love to hear a recording. I can't imagine how awful we must have sounded. We had a good time, and I always made my own money, so there, you know. But my formal debut occurred in 1968 at the Columbia Club, which was the Knights of Columbus Hall, right across the street from my home parish, St. Alphonsus. They were looking for folks to participate in the 1968 annual parish talent show, Anything Goes. I auditioned, and I was given a solo spot in the show to perform 2 pieces. The selection I picked to kick off my musical career was the theme from the 1960 movie starring Paul Newman, Exodus. Here's a photo of young Elwood at his first performance. Aw, so cute. I don't know what happened, but he's pretty cute. Now, as we pan out, you can see just how sophisticated an affair this really was. Yep, we just slapped those glow-in-the-dark notes on everything with good old masking tape. Didn't bother to try to hide masking tape or anything. And I'll have you know, that's my best pair of formal white crew socks. We wore white socks forever. I didn't know there was any other color socks. Here's a picture of the whole cast. Now looking back on it, what a great thing that so many folks showed up for a church talent show. And it was a great experience for me. It was a lot of fun people doing a lot of fun stuff, and it was pretty cool. So, the second piece I played, you ask? The Helena Polka. Okay, back to the task at hand. So from today through the end of November, we'll be exploring one of the truly most important books in all of Scripture. There are so many books in the Old Testament. Now I know some of you out there have a thorough knowledge of the Bible and are much more well-read in the Old Testament than I am. I grew up Catholic, so we didn't do the Bible so much, but I bet I know more about the lives of the saints than you do. So what gripping tales come to mind when I mention the book of Ezra? Hosea, Obadiah, Micah, Habakkuk. Yeah, that's what I thought. But Exodus, that's the main attraction. Of all the Old Testament stories that almost everyone knows, the biggest hits come from Exodus. The burning bush, hard-hearted Pharaoh forcing the Israelite slaves to make bricks without straw, the Nile turning to blood, and all those other horrible plagues. The Lord passing over the Hebrew houses whose lintels were sprinkled with the blood of the newly slaughtered lambs, while the angel of death took the firstborn sons of the Egyptian houses, even the heir to the throne. Crossing the Red Sea, which parted for them. The manna and the quail in the desert. And of course, the giving of the Ten Commandments on Mount Sinai. Wow. This is a family story to end all family stories. This is Israel's sacred history. In his book, Understanding the Old Testament, Bernard Anderson says it this way: when we want to know someone, we ask them to tell us a story about themselves or their families. To be a self is to have a personal history. This is true on a larger national level as well. National self-consciousness finds expression in the remembrance of events that people have lived through and that have given them a sense of identity and destiny. Now, in most family stories I've heard, events are pretty down to earth. Biblical stories are another matter entirely. These larger-than-life stories relate larger-than-life, downright impossible events. We can all nod our head in acceptance of the occasional coincidence, but one incredibly huge coincidence after another, some of which defy the laws of physics and nature, that's a little harder to buy into. So to begin with, one of the troubling questions about the miraculous events in the book of Exodus and many other astounding stories in both the Old and New Testament is, did these things actually happen the way they're narrated? Or do they have a rational or scientific explanation? Now, as you can imagine, there are schools of thought on both sides of that question. Biblical fundamentalists usually assert that the Bible is the literal word of God and is to be read literally. I personally don't hold that view, nor do actually most mainstream Christian denominations whose understanding of Scripture is informed by rigorous, and I mean rigorous, literary investigation, requiring deep knowledge of ancient Near Eastern languages, not just Hebrew, but all of them. And there are more than you'd think. Ancient history, archaeology, anthropology, comparative religious and cultural. That's a lot of work. You come up with a lot of different answers. That's why there's so much back and forth about the Bible and people believing all these different things. There are all kinds of ways of approaching that literature. Ancient Eastern languages are famous for exaggeration, hyperbole, over-the-top gestures, symbolic language that attempts to communicate realities beyond description, but that are deeply meaningful and life-changing and have to be communicated somehow. And, of course, it's impossible for us modern Westerners to put ourselves in the mindset of Bronze Age or Iron Age Mesopotamian nomads who knew nothing of what we now know that might explain such phenomena. On the other hand, I wasn't there. I certainly can't comprehend the unimaginable power of God, so maybe they did happen exactly the way it says. Speaking of understanding languages, okay, boomers, here's your chance to shine. Who remembers how to conjugate the verb to be? I'll take volunteers. Oh, come on, class. All right, this is Sister Materna standing up here now. Let's conjugate the verb to be. I am, you are, he, she, it is, we are, you are, they are. Now I know we do different things with pronouns these days. Generally, the conjugation still works. Okay, with that in mind, when Moses asks God, "Who shall I say sent me to you?" what does God say? I am. I am who I am. I am sent me to you. What a weird answer. Really, what sense does that make? I am. I am what? I am who? Nope. I am. Now, there's a whole stream of theological reflection that centers around the idea, get this, God's name is a verb. It is the very essence of God to exist, to create, and to make things happen. The Hebrew, if I remember it right, is Ehiyah Asher Ehiyah, I am who am. Now, Hebrew is a fairly simple and straightforward language, especially when you compare it to monsters like Greek and German. Those languages have conjugations, declensions, tenses, and moods to pin down every last little detail. I took one semester of Greek, enough to know that I was only going to take one semester of Greek. The most impressive thing I remember is that it's possible to take a complex Greek sentence and rearrange all the words in that sentence into columns of nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, direct and indirect objects, with all their little inflections and endings, and you can still read that sentence and understand exactly what it's saying. That boggles my mind. Hebrew, on the other hand, is much older, for one thing, and much simpler, which makes it easier to learn, except for the alphabet and the fact that everything goes from right to left. But that makes it much more challenging to translate, because the same words can mean different things depending on the context. And the same verbs can mean different things or be thought of in different tenses depending on the context. So God's name, I am, can also mean I was, I will be, I create, I cause, I do, and so on, depending on the context. So linguistically, it's a puzzle. But theologically, God's possibilities are infinite, because they all apply. All right, so with that little detour in mind, let's go back to the incredible events in the book of Exodus. Whether they happened literally, as they are narrated, or are simpler events that have been theologically exaggerated, the result in my mind is this. Whatever the events were which led this ragtag group of slaves to escape from the most powerful and advanced civilization on the face of the earth to become their own sovereign nation, were of such incredible significance for them as to be understood only as accomplished or possible by the intervention of God, whose very name is, I do things. I make things happen. Our friend Bernard Anderson, in his book, Understanding the Old Testament, puts it like this. This decisive event, the great watershed of Israel's history, was the Exodus from Egypt. Even today, the Jewish people understand their vocation and destiny in the light of this revealing event, which made them a people and became their undying memory. Just as the Christian remembers and relives the sacrifice of Jesus Christ in the celebration of the Lord's Supper, so the Jew recalls and makes contemporary the Exodus as he celebrates Passover. This act of worship is not just a retreat from the present into the unrecoverable once upon a time. Rather, the believing Jew sees himself or herself or themselves as a participant in that experience. This event of the past enters into the present with deep meaning. So according to the traditional interpretation of the Passover, get this. In every generation, one must look upon him or herself as if he personally had come forth from Egypt. He personally, that's me, had come forth from Egypt, in keeping with the biblical command, and thou shalt tell thy son in that day, saying, it is because of that which the Lord did to me when I went forth from Egypt. For it was not our fathers alone whom the Holy One, blessed be he, redeemed, but also us, whom he redeemed with them, as it is said, and us he brought out thence, that he might lead us to and give us the land which he swore to our fathers. Wow. I mean, think about that. This ancient story that happened thousands of years ago to people I can't ever know, and that I'm not even sure happened the way it says, is somehow supposed to be my story as I live and breathe here today. Now, if I think of that story as my story, I start thinking about it like this. Are there events in my own life that are of such incredible significance for them to be understood only as accomplished or possible by the intervention of God? Well, yes. Yes. And yes. Now, I've never seen the kinds of miracles and phenomena I read about in this story, but yes. Because on my own, I could never have organized or brought about the amazing, life-changing, life-saving, and life-giving coincidences that have brought me to this pulpit on this Sunday morning. Boggles my mind. I shouldn't be here. I have no business being here. Any number of things could have gone any number of different ways, and I'd be somewhere else doing something else, but no. And a lot of you know my story. It's like, I shouldn't be here, but here I am. And when I think about that, even as I'm standing here right now looking at all of you, it's like, are you kidding me? Wow. Now, there are many personal watershed exodus moments for me. The big one is my exodus from the bondage of drugs and alcohol into the freedom of a community of other recovering people. Now, many of these people have only disdain for any organized religion. I hear it week after week after week. I hate organized religion. I grew up Catholic. You never hear anybody say they're a recovering Methodist or recovering Presbyterian, by the way. But it's laughable. It's like, oh man, I think we did a bad thing. The people who say, I'm a recovering Catholic, there's so many people, at least the recovering folks that I hang out with, who are like, I can't stand organized religion. Those nuns, blah, 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 blah. And it's like, yeah, I get it. I mean, religion doesn't have a good track record, let's face it. I mean, I used to work for the company that brought you the Spanish Inquisition. That was one of our biggest hits. That's makes you wonder. Yet these people who have only disdain for religion see the hand of God in everything. They turn their lives and their wills over to a higher power every morning, and they ask to do God's will rather than their own will every day. That's freedom. For us in recovery, that's promised land, folks. Now, my second most important deliverance story is the acceptance of this old drug-addicted gay man into this community. Now, many of you out there have seen the dirtiest of my dirty laundry. Not going to make it through this. You said yes to me anyway. You continue to take me into your hearts, and you've even invited me to stand up here and preach. Friends, those are miracles that can only be understood or comprehended as something that only God can do. God made these things happen because God does these kinds of things. That's God's name. I do these kinds of things. All right. Now, here's the big preacher question. It cracks me up that I'm about to ask it. It's like, well, who does that guy think he is? What's your story? When you get together with your family or friends or fellow sojourners, what Exodus stories do you tell? What kind of bondage or suffering or slavery or darkness has God delivered you from? What stories of God's grace and generosity can you tell? Now, if you don't think there are any, you're just not looking hard enough. Or you're explaining too many of them away. Or you're hard-hearted like Pharaoh. Friends, whatever amazing coincidences you tell in your stories, they are no less miraculous than the burning bush or the parting of the Red Sea, because that's what God does. And you shall tell your children that it is because of what the Lord did to you when you went forth from the land of Egypt. For it was not just your ancestors whom the Holy One redeemed, but also you, whom he redeemed with them. As it is said, and us he brought from there that he might lead us into the land he swore to our ancestors. Thanks be to God.